How about inside?
Okay. Yeah, we thought we would do that program like that, and then we're going to modify it each time so that everybody will get a similar version. How's everybody doing today? The sun is out, yes. Today is definitely an upgrade over the rest of the week, isn't it?
I'd forgotten how blue the skies really are, not just in song, but when you see them. I come from West Michigan these days, where we don't see the sky very much for 6 months between October and April. The curse of lake effect snow blinds us to. But on the other hand, when it comes to April, it's like a Russian spring. You know, the world begins over again. Wouldn't you? Well, no, I better not say. Yeah, I know. Since when did I hold back? Thinking of the current political scene, wouldn't you identify with the world beginning over again? Anyway, Ronald Reagan used to quote Thomas Paine. So I'm just quoting Reagan.
Right. I hope everyone realizes this is bonus time. This isn't the program yet.
Hello, my name is Gabriel Mullen, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. The Dole Student Advisory Board is comprised of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive many great opportunities. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. We would like to encourage each of you to get special benefits and support the Dole Institute by becoming a friend of the Dole Institute. If you enjoy this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by a sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Dr. Barbara Ballard.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics and part one of this year's presidential lecture series, 1 to 44, the best and the worst of American presidents. This event is the first in a four-part series. We hope you will join us this Tuesday, February 27th at 7 p.m. for part two of the series. Please also mark your calendars for the third and the fourth installment of the series on March 12th and March 14th. Both of those programs will be held at 7 p.m. Tonight's interview will be conducted by Dole Institute Director Bill Lacey. Today's guest has a long-standing relationship to the Dole Institute. In addition to serving as the Institute's first permanent director, he has delivered many outstanding lectures on presidential history and politics. He has served as director for a host of renowned institutions, including the presidential libraries of Herbert Hoover, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, Gerald R. Ford, and Abraham Lincoln. He is a frequent contributor to outlets such as Time, the New York Times, C-SPAN, and the PBS NewsHour. He has also served as a member of the academic advisory team for the C-SPAN Presidential Historians Survey, which will serve as a backdrop to this series. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the nation's foremost, note I said foremost, presidential scholars, Richard Norton Smith.
Richard, welcome back to the Dole Institute.
It's nice to be back.
It's great to have you here today. We're going to focus kind of on the broad aspect of presidential rankings, And then our last three programs will get into more specific presidents. But let's start out with a really general question, Richard. Why do we have presidential rankings? Why do we do it?
Well, it gives academics something to do outside the classroom. I have to tell you up front, the older I get, the more, I suppose, experience I have become dubious about the whole process. And that is, I say that as someone who's taken part in all three of the C-SPAN rankings, the most recent of which is in your program. Now, to be honest, C-SPAN made a very deliberate and I think largely successful effort to accommodate some of my concerns. First of all, when you sit down and do one of these things, you have to devise criteria. What are the yardsticks that you employ? And, they're the traditional, how the president deals with Congress, his foreign affairs record, economic management, and what we tried to do with we created 10 criteria for the C-SPAN survey, which tried to reflect the fact, and this gets to my concern, this is not a one-size-fits-all question. There's a reason why you can't apply, say, a test of economic management to Martin Van Buren, who had a Great Depression during his presidency, in the same way that you would to FDR or Herbert Hoover or more recent presidents. The fact of the matter is the presidency of the 19th century is a totally different office from what it became in the 20th century, and arguably perhaps what it is becoming in the 21st. And there are a number of ways that you could measure that, but certainly nobody expected in the 19th century. People thought that there was a boom and bust theory of the economy. You'd have good times, and then invariably there'd be a bubble followed by a swoop down the roller coaster, and it was an act of God. And you just had to wait for let the economy find its place, and it would in effect right itself. And the victims of this, of course, were people thrown out of work and their families. It really, Grover Cleveland in the 1890s had the worst depression in American history before the 1930s. And Cleveland made it a point of pride that the government would not support the people. He even said, the role of the people to support the government, not the other way around. Well, by the 1930s, we had become a much larger, much more industrialized, much more sophisticated nation and certainly economy. And the thought that in 1929, 30, 31, that you could stand by and adopt Cleveland's approach. I mean, Hoover is criticized because he wasn't FDR. But the fact is, Hoover did more than arguably all of the presidents before him because he didn't believe in the boom and bust. What he wouldn't do, and here's where he sounds like Grover Cleveland, he believed as a point of moral conviction that with the best of intentions, if government got in the business of providing direct relief for individuals, no matter how difficult the circumstances, that over the long run, you would undermine the national character. And he was severely criticized for that at the time, and he's paid a high price nationally. FDR, unlike Hoover, Hoover was a man defined by his convictions. FDR was a man defined by his pragmatism. Remember, which is the polite word for not basically being tethered to an ideology or a philosophy. But it turned out, under those circumstances, that Roosevelt's approach, I think history would say, was much more successful. I mean, he famously said that if he could read the mood of the country, and he was very, very attuned to that, if he could read the mood of the country correctly, it was basically to people in government, try something. If it doesn't work, admit it, try something else. But above all, try. And that really is the improvised presidency, which grew into the modern presidency, the Roosevelt, what I call the Arthur Schlesinger model of the American presidency, where the president is at the center. The president dictates the national agenda. The president overawes Congress. The president uses mass media to bring the people along with him. That's our grandfather's presidency. Great quote. I wrote it down. In 1951, the leading political scientist of his day, a man named Clinton Rossiter, this is what he said of the modern presidency. The president is not a Gulliver immobilized by 10,000 tiny cords, nor even a Prometheus chained to a rock of frustration. He is rather a kind of magnificent lion who can roam widely and do great deeds, so long as he does not try to break loose from his broad reservation. Now, in 1951, writing under the influence of both Roosevelt's, Wilson, and Truman, that made perfect sense. The mistake that maybe Dr. Rossiter's generation made, and it's one that we're all inclined to, is to believe that this was a permanent solution, that this was the only model of the presidency going forward, just as Martin Van Buren's generation might have mistakenly believed that they had the final answer. Along came Ronald Reagan. And I would argue, whatever you think of Reagan, whatever you think of his policies, Reagan turned out to be as much a transformational figure in his own time as Roosevelt had been before him. I would argue that along with the age of Jackson, we could speak of an age of Roosevelt and an age of Reagan. And I'm not sure we're out of the age of Reagan yet. But the fact that, and it turned out Reagan has antecedents in his approach to the presidency. Think of the word freedom. Have you ever heard a politician who does not appeal to our love of freedom? Now, we might have, 200 different definitions of that word for everyone who's here, but it's the civic religion. This is gross oversimplification, but if you want two models of the presidency, there are presidents who promise us freedom through government. FDR comes to mind, LBJ. And there are presidents who promise us freedom from government. And I think of Jefferson and Coolidge and Reagan. So, as long as we're dealing in gross oversimplifications, that's Teddy Roosevelt had his own gross oversimplification, self-serving as it was. He said there are two kinds of presidents, Lincoln types and Buchanan types. And now even James Buchanan's looking pretty good. One last thing, and then I'll shut up. John F. Kennedy said, interestingly enough, to the great historian David Herbert Donald, who visited him at the White House. And they were in the Oval Office, and Kennedy obviously had just read the papers and was frustrated. He said, no one, he said, should try to pass judgment on an American president. And then he paused. He said, not even poor old James Buchanan, who has not sat at this desk and looked at the paper that crosses this desk. Well, I understand where he's coming from, but that's a kind of special pleading. Very few of us will ever have admission to that select audience.
Who participates in the C-SPAN ranking?
That's a very interesting thing. Again, C-SPAN, faithful to its nonpartisan, non-ideological mission, really goes out of their way. Let's face it, most of the surveys traditionally have been made up of academics, political scientists in particular, who tend to lean left. Certainly Arthur Schlesinger was not actively recruiting conservatives to include in his very influential surveys. And C-SPAN took that into account. It's not that they made a special effort to reach out to conservatives, although they were really seeking balance, but they were mindful of the fact that if you just went back to the usual suspects, you would wind up with the usual results. And they've also made a very deliberate effort to include women and people of color to really broaden the electorate, if you will. And I think that's reflected in results that, although, some things never change. There's what I call the Holy Trinity, Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, who will, in all likelihood, always show up at the top of any such survey. But beneath that, there are some really interesting changes. And some of them, U.S. Grant has been rediscovered. Long before Ron Chernow wrote his magnificent book. Anyone here reading the Chernow? Well, more should. It's formidable. It's Ron Chernow, 800 or 900 pages, but 800 or 900 gripping pages. And it's not as if we've discovered, presidential reputations change for a couple of obvious reasons. One is because scholars come to a place like this and they dig around the archives, particularly for the more recent presidents, and they discover things. Dwight Eisenhower's reputation began to soar after 1966. That's when his papers became available out in Abilene. And all of a sudden, people said, wait a second, this is not the grandfatherly, good-natured duffer, that we thought occupied the White House for 8 years. This is a sophisticated, politically shrewd operator, what came to be known as hidden hand leadership. That's the first thing that happens. The second is we're dealing with the same body of information, but we have changed. We are seeing it from a different perspective. Grant is a classic illustration. For most of our history, Grant was written off as a great general, lousy president, surrounded by corruption, in over his head, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then something happened called the 1960s. And all sorts of historians discovered all sorts of people in the American story who had been left out of that story, including, obviously, people of color, the American Indian, Native American. And suddenly, Grant was seen not as the politically naive victim, but as the last president for 100 years who was willing to send federal troops into the South to protect the rights of the former slave, which was an act of great courage and arguably political foolhardiness, at the same time. So it isn't that we've discovered a whole lot of new information about Grant, although the fact that the Grant papers are now available is certainly a great boon to scholars. But we're seeing with different eyes. And that's one reason why no president's reputation, except maybe the Holy Trinity, is entirely safe. If we had this conversation 20 years from now, some of these names might surprise you if they move up or down the list.
We'll all just get together in 20 years
Well.
and reassess. Yeah, you mentioned Grant because I was going to ask you, but he jumped from 2000. He was 33rd in the C-SPAN poll. He jumped to 22 last year, so that's an 11-place jump, which is pretty
enormous.
pretty significant.
Let's face it, most, particularly presidents, that era is benighted. There's a wonderful new book out. I would recommend it, by Richard White in the Oxford History of America series on the Gilded Age. And White has a marvelous phrase. The Gilded Age, the period from the end of the Civil War to the turn of the century, is for most historians what he calls flyover country. I would go further and say it's the one period in our history that most Americans are too embarrassed to really talk about. And can you remember all those presidents? Remember, they all had beards, and they all fought in the Civil War, but you can't remember. It's really hard to tell them apart. They sort of swim in collective memory. And so consequently, as you can imagine, for one of them, U.S. Grant, to move up so dramatically, something has to have happened. It hasn't happened yet for Rutherford B. Hayes or Chester Arthur.
Talk a little bit about how C-SPAN compares to some of the other rankings, and do you personally feel C-SPAN is a better indicator?
Well, I don't know if it's better or worse. It's just different. I mean, I think C-SPAN makes a supreme effort, as I say, to be inclusive, representative, unbiased, and that includes the advisory group, and that includes the electorate that they well, I think that close to 100 people who responded. Now, other polls are made up of different, like any poll, the result depends on who you talk to. I saw just this President's Day always brings, new rankings. And if you notice, some of you may have seen, there was a poll exclusively of political scientists, about 170, I believe, that found, well, for example, I think they had Obama in the top 10, which does not surprise me in the least. I mean, again, given the electorate. James Buchanan was no longer the worst American president. I'll leave it at that, which also doesn't surprise me, given the makeup. And who's to say that that's any more legitimate than someone else? A number of years ago, I was asked to participate in a survey that led to a book that was actually a product of the Wall Street Journal, and it was very interesting because it was so counterintuitive. It was I think you'd say somewhat right of center where they were coming from, and so they still had the Holy Trinity. I think in many cases, reluctantly, they had to accept FDR was among the great presidents. But beneath that, it's shoveled. So it reflects on whether there's a liberal bias or a conservative bias, a purely academic bias. They all have biases. My point is, C-SPAN, aware of that, makes a really, really concerted effort to be as unbiased as possible.
Does C-SPAN, do all the people who participate, are they all academics?
No.
No?
That's a great point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Again, because they don't, I mean, C-SPAN is, and again, I can only speak for myself, but my experience has been C-SPAN is broadly based. It is certainly a home where academics can be at home, but it is interested also in reaching a mass audience. And for lack of a better word, popularizing history. I mean, I know some of the long form series we've done, and there's one coming up, by the way, which I think they've announced. They're doing, I'd suggested, 1968 was such a transformative year. I mean, we're still living with the consequences of 1968, politically and otherwise, certainly culturally. And lots of people will do 1968 retrospective. What's different about C-SPAN is they're willing to take, in this case, 9 weeks and devote 90 minutes times 9 to breaking down 1968 in all sorts of avenues. And that's going to be running starting next month. So anyway, my C-SPAN bias showing itself.
Okay. Now, there's interesting comparisons that you can make. The Siena survey and some of the others do not rank. We talked about Reagan a few minutes ago. Very well. Reagan was 18 in Siena, but
that's because I
C-SPAN
believe
is
the
11.
Siena. I believe the Siena survey. Unlike again, your point, which I didn't really answer, about reaching out beyond the academic ghetto to include journalists, political operatives, real-world practitioners, people who had been in the White House for both parties. I mean, people who bring not only academic experience, but practical, hands-on experience of the presidency, which to me is a very logical approach. But as far as I know, no one else follows that approach. I think the Siena survey was limited to academics. And, I think Reagan, I think Reagan will bounce around a bit more than perhaps either his admirers or detractors. I think he's, how you feel, well, in the case of the Clintons, for example, Bill Clinton rose and then plateaued in the C-SPAN survey. How you feel about the 1960s is a key to how you feel about the Clintons, fair or not. And I think, likewise, the 1980s, we're still too close. I don't think we have the perspective of time yet. But my hunch is, as Reagan has become an iconic figure, the face of conservatism, interestingly enough, and again, in all seriousness, I would argue what passes for conservatism today, at least at the presidential level, bears only passing resemblance to Reagan conservatism. And that's not a pro or con, it's just we're all products and somewhat prisoners of our time. I mean, did either you or I think that Reagan conservatism would be supplanted by a different kind of conservatism, at least in our lifetime? I mean, yes, Reagan pursued his own version of détente, I suppose, with the Soviet Union, but only on the way to, as he said, consigning it to the ash heap of history. Ronald Reagan, well, let's just say I think Reagan's approach to the Russians would differ markedly from the current occupant of the White House. I'd love to be at a dinner party where they were perhaps talking past each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Throw in Lenin for dessert.
Right. Some of the, obviously you mentioned kind of the Trinity, but some of the other pretty highly ranked presidents, weren't, at least to me, as obvious. Polk, Monroe, even Truman. Why do they get so far up the list?
Okay. Truman is a classic illustration of my point. It isn't as if we forget how unpopular Harry Truman was when he left office. Not with the academics, per se, but with the people. I mean, Truman went out of office with a poll rating not much better than Nixon's when he resigned on the presidency. At one point, Truman's numbers were down. I think Galpoli had a 23% approval rating. And you have to remember, this was a different era when people believed in government, trusted their leaders. I mean, for anyone, for anything, to get a 23% approval rating, it was pretty startling. But of course, the Korean War was unpopular, and his decision to fire Douglas MacArthur, although hailed by scholars and I think accepted by the public today, was intensely unpopular at the time. Truman did a lot of bold things, and when you do bold things, you make enemies. So he'd made a lot of enemies, but he made a lot of history. And I think most people would say, in retrospect, that most of the decisions he made were the right ones. So it isn't as if we have some vast new storehouse, or we haven't discovered a cache of papers or letters that shed new light on Truman. We've changed. I mean, collectively, we've lived through the 60 years since. We've experienced McCarthyism and the Cold War and the space race and Watergate. And remember, Harry Truman died in December 1972, before Watergate. But the real revival, the popular revival of Truman, the whole notion of give him hell, Harry, is a phenomenon that really picked up steam in the wake of Watergate, at a time when people were shocked, I mean, more than people are shockable today, at what they saw as the excesses, the illegalities, and the lies of their government. Harry Truman, plain-spoken, uncoached, unsophisticated in some ways, Truman came to be seen as the real deal. Authenticity. You know, Truman famously said he had no use for poles. He said, imagine if Moses had taken a pole while crossing the desert, you know? And how many presidents would inspire, you know, one-man stage shows? I mean, James Whitmore, you know, made a living for years portraying Truman as this feisty, truth-telling individual. So I think Truman was seen through a different lens. And he was contrasted. And by the way, not just Watergate, but Vietnam. It's bipartisan. People had come to distrust both parties, presidents of both parties. And they looked back at Truman and they saw someone who was not the byproduct of political handlers, who no doubt would have been the bane of political handlers. You know, this little, at the time, the little man from Missouri, the failed haberdasher, who had much of John Adams had the impossible task of following George Washington. Harry Truman had to, you know, put on the shoes, the outside shoes of Franklin Roosevelt. And look at just in the 6 months, the first 6 months of what he had to deal with. You know, the end of the war, obviously in Europe, and the decision to drop the bomb, and end the war in Japan, the occupation of Japan, the start of the Cold War, the creation of a bipartisan foreign policy, the Marshall Plan, NATO. I mean, the Truman administration had more history squeezed into a relatively few years, and it has stood the test of time. So Truman is a great example of how a president, and now I think he's at home in the top 10, and it's hard to see, for all those reasons, it's hard to see how he leaves the top 10. The other example, Ike, of course, on the other hand, Ike illustrates my other point, the fact that when we get new material, in his case, his papers, and the contrast between the very sure-footed, innately politically gifted. You don't get to be a 5-star general in the Army if you don't have political skills. Eisenhower's genius was to mask the fact that he had political skills. He demonstrated, like George Washington, his hero, he demonstrated, like Ronald Reagan would, or I would argue Gerald Ford, in politics, it's much better to be underestimated than overestimated. You can surprise people on the upside. And fortunately, Truman did not live long enough to see this transformation. Eisenhower, before he died in 1969, could see it coming. Murray Kempton, the great liberal columnist and commentator, a brilliant man, and a day when columnists wielded much more influence than they do today. But for Murray Kempton, arch New Yorker, to write a very influential essay in 1966 called The Underestimation of Dwight D. Eisenhower, it almost opened the doors. It was okay for academics to reassess Eisenhower. And then, of course, Fred Greenstein at Princeton wrote a book about hidden hand leadership, which was the perfect phrase. Ike was behind the scenes pulling the strings on Nixon, or using Sherman Adams, his chief of staff. I mean, Ike and Nixon was somewhat bitter about this. he was no mean operator himself, and he figured it out. Eisenhower always had to have people around him who could serve as lightning rods. That was part of hidden hand leadership. For most people, they just remember him for his smile. Well, you know, you'd smile too if you had people doing the dirty work, you know, and you got to announce the peace treaties. But it was a very shrewd Washingtonian approach to the presidency. So and again, I think both Truman and Eisenhower, different as they are, illustrate the fact that no presidential reputation is final, except maybe Mr. Buchanan's and some of his company at the bottom of the list. Interestingly, the worst presidents, generally, the worst presidents are those surrounding the greatest failure in American constitutional history, the Civil War. So it's Pierce and Buchanan before the war, and my candidate for the worst president, and we'll talk about this later more, but Andrew Johnson after the war. Presidents who either through their inaction or in Pierce's case, perverse action, and everyone in Lawrence ought to remember the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was Pierce who really actively, I think, brought on the war. I'm not sure the war could have been avoided. The great question, of course, that's unanswerable is if Abraham Lincoln had been president in 1856 instead of 1861, or James Buchanan had been president in 1861, how would our history have been different? If Franklin Roosevelt, or better yet, if Herbert Hoover had been elected president in almost any time other than 1928, I would submit he might very well be in the top 10 himself for his personal qualities and accomplishments. But, you know, as I say, you dance with the soldier who brung you. And you don't get to determine when you become president or often the events you have to deal with. The single biggest misconception that feeds into this whole process is that presidents are more powerful than they are, that presidents should be judged by their inaugural addresses, you know, by the agenda that they set out on January 20th. That's never been true, and I would argue it's less true given the modern media than ever. The presidency is an office of reaction more than of action. And that's why FDR's improvised presidency is in many ways a model. John F. Kennedy entered office a fairly conventional, fairly timid, Cold Warrior who didn't really want to talk about civil rights. And events forced his hand on both issues. And I would argue, again, he's in the top 10. It became fashionable for a while because we deified Kennedy, of course, after his assassination. The pendulum swings. That's another inviolable rule historically. What's in fashion today will be out of fashion tomorrow. And the pendulum swung to the other extreme, and it became fashionable to denigrate. He was only president for 2.5 years. What did he accomplish? He didn't get a lot of bills passed. Well, that's one school of thought. I would argue there's a much larger story. If you think of, again, history squeezed in those 2.5 years, the Civil Rights Revolution really came of age. We lived through not only the Bay of Pigs, but barely the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy grew. We all like to think that when a president puts his hand on the Bible and takes that magical 33-word oath of office, first sanctified by George Washington, that suddenly, you know, pixie dust is spread over him and he becomes more than he was. And sometimes it happens, and those are happy chapters in American history. More often than not, it doesn't happen. then you have Warren Harding and Franklin Pierce. But I would argue JFK was someone who did grow. And on the defining issues of his time, civil rights and the Cold War, by the time he died, he was a very different, and I would argue a much better president than he had been for all the trumpet call rhetorical flourishes of his inaugural address.
Let me ask you this question, Richard. I noticed, and I found this fascinating because it's the only example that I saw of two, of a president and a successor who were ranked together. Ford and Carter, 25-26.
Yeah, right about the middle.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, look, they were, there's a curse of the 1970s, as anyone who lived through it, and its fashion can attest. How many people have leisure suits in the far back of the closet? And I think I think again we tend to lump them with the period that is a period that I think Americans have real trouble dealing with. And I'm not sure. As you know, I'm writing a comprehensive, and Linda Kay can attest to just how comprehensive a biography of Gerald Ford. And people are going to be very surprised. I'm surprised. And I knew the man. As you know, I delivered a eulogy at his funeral. And the book is certainly not eulogistic in tone. If it's to have any credibility, it has to be critical and detached. But rather like Eisenhower, who was his hero and his role model. Someone said Ford was Ike without the medals. His syntax could be scrambled, but he had a much better brain than he let on, and he was perfectly comfortable being underestimated as well. You asked what did you ask me?
Carter and Ford together.
Yeah, Carter, and I think I'll tell you, I should make predictions. I think right now I think we've got it backwards. People are almost unanimous in praise for Carter's ex-presidency. And I always say the more people heap praise on your ex-presidency, the odds are the less successful they think you were as a president. People think Hoover was a wonderful ex-president, and in many ways he was. I think the time will come after the president's gone, perhaps, when people will take a fresh look. There's a book coming out. In fact, I would strongly endorse it. I wrote a blurb for it, so I have no trouble endorsing it, by Stuart Eisenstadt, who was his sort of policy guru. Right. Very, very fair, very objective. It's sort of what Robert Sherwood did for FDR, or to some degree Ted Sorensen with JFK. But it's a great big book on the Carter presidency. And he had 5,000 pages of yellow legal pad notes that he took. He was in every meeting. He was privy to every appointment. And he has, interestingly enough, he's an admirer of the president, but he has the critical detachment to be able to point out his flaws, which were considerable. But the notion that nothing got done during the Carter years, except maybe the Camp David Accords, just does not ring true. You may not have liked but the fact is Carter actually has one of the highest percentages of legislative success of any president in the 20th century.
I had no clue.
And yeah. Exactly. If you look at environmental legislation, consumer protection, look what he did for the National Park Service. It really goes on and on. And then, of course, you have Camp David. But at the same time, and it's also part of the record, and it's what most of us remember, he is saddled, rather like Hoover, with responsibility for economic distress that he didn't cause and that he could not resolve. One of the things that I think is encouraging, because you can all rank the presidents, You don't need a degree. I think there's an encouraging sophistication in the American electorate, a growing awareness that a president's powers to affect your economic standing are necessarily limited. That, particularly as we move into a global economy, what happens in Beijing tomorrow may actually affect the price of corn, today. And the fact is that presidents have always been, in my opinion, unduly praised or unduly criticized if the economy is not performing to, popular expectations. That doesn't mean we're going back to the age of Martin Van Buren and Grover Cleveland. I don't think you could ever, I guarantee you, the next recession, and it's coming, surely, under whatever president, I can guarantee you there will be immediate cries on both sides of the aisle to do more, to spend more. But in any event, that's, again, just part of the currents of history.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I wanted to ask your thoughts on, President Obama clearly had a historic presidency. He's ranked number 12 in C-SPAN. Is that, how do you see that?
I think that's about right. I think, I will say it is higher. Usually, when a president, just as a president leaves office, in some ways, the only criticism I would make of the C-SPAN surveys are their timing. We did one in 2001 at the end of the Clinton presidency. Well, of course, the first question everyone had was, how did Bill Clinton fare? And we did one in 2009 at the end of the second Bush presidency, the same question, substituting Bush's name, and likewise Obama. And in some ways, it's unfair to the president just leaving office. Richard Nixon said, and it's apropos, because if some think of all three of those men, in their own way, were polarizing figures. They didn't set out to be divisive, but it's the nature almost less of them than of our political culture. Richard Nixon, who was the supremely divisive political figure, said that it would take 50 years before anyone could write objectively about him. I don't think it takes 50 years, but I think Bill Clinton, for example, I would argue we're still too close to the Clinton presidency to pass any kind of, fixed judgment. I'll give you an example. Sensitive as this may be, if you could unspool events of the last 6 months, and there was no Me Too movement to speak of, if the issue of abuse, sometimes literally physical abuse of women, and discrimination in the workplace, sometimes carried to absurd lengths, if that issue had not forced its way to the front of the national conversation, it would be a different climate in which to assess Bill Clinton. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president, we would be talking about someone who had more or less permanently, insofar as anything is permanent, changed the Democratic Party to a slightly left of center party, but essentially a centrist party. Remember, Bill Clinton gave us a balanced budget. He said, I don't think he meant it, but he said the era of big government is over. And that was a very shrewd reaction on his part to the political currents that he was swimming against. So in the case of Barack Obama, it's insanely early. I don't think, for example, my hunch is, and it's just a hunch, that if you took that survey was taken a year ago, if you took that survey last week, my hunch is, for reasons having more to do with his successor than anything Obama did, he'd probably rank higher. And it would be in reaction to efforts to promote the opposite view of the Obama presidency. So, like it or not, and it's not of his doing, I suspect it's not as he would have it, but the fact is any president immediately after leaving office is going to be, even though he may be through with partisan politics, he and his record unavoidably are part of the debate. After all, a successor validates himself, legitimizes himself to some degree as a reaction to what went before. Bill Clinton, if you were going to, in 1992, if a computer was going to design a candidate who stylistically and by life experience was the opposite of George H.W. Bush, you couldn't do much better than Bill Clinton. After 8 years of Bill Clinton, there was something called Clinton fatigue, and George W. Bush was the beneficiary. After 8 years of Bush, there was Bush fatigue, and Barack Obama was elected in no small measure because he was seen as a polar opposite. Even though on leaving office, Obama had positive job ratings in the polls, and certainly millions of people who have an unusual, almost passionate belief in Obama, and the symbolic presidency in some ways that he represented and still represents. The fact of the matter is that after 8 years, the country, whoever is president, the country tends to be in the mood for change. Arguably, they did not anticipate the degree of change, but that's true of any time you go to the polls, you know. Voters are asked to do all sorts of things when they vote for a president. They should not expect to be clairvoyant.
I have one last question, then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But I found this kind of interesting. Two presidents who were failures politically, Johnson because of Vietnam, Nixon because of Watergate. Johnson still is ranked rather high. He's in the top third. Nixon's in the second third, so he's right in the middle. So talk a little bit about this.
See, this is the danger of these surveys. With the best of intentions, how do you rank Richard Nixon, who is the first line of his political obit will always read, he was the only American president forced to resign. Now, it's possible, you know, who knows? Someday there may be other presidents, and you have to rewrite that. Maybe someday the opening line will be, and who opened China to the world. So, you know, there's that living, long after a president dies, his legacy lives on to be debated and shaped and questioned and defined and redefined. Lyndon Johnson was the most accomplished legislative president, arguably in American history. And whether you like it or not, whether you know it or not, we are living in a world that Lyndon Johnson created. If you're on Medicare, if you watch public TV, if you have grandchildren in Head Start, I can go on and on. The fact is that collectively, if you ask people, they would probably, frankly, be critical of the Great Society. It became a symbol of overreaching government. But they're perfectly willing to take the check when it arrives. The notion that, so Johnson is on many levels a cautionary tale. There are those who believe the American Republic demonstrated its extraordinary strength, its enduring institutional survivability, that it had 10 years of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, two men who psychiatrists might have a field day interpreting. Forget their politics. I mean, it's bipartisan madness is. So, and again, we're close. There's a whole generation. You all grew up. I mean, seeing these people on TV, defining moments. You know, Richard Nixon showed us in 1952 with the checker speech. You can laugh, but the fact of the matter is, Richard, that night, we never again looked at television in the same way. We realized that television, more than any other instrument in modern political life, could affect how we see public figures. And, you know, 60 years on, we have a president who spends much of his day watching television and reacting to it, and we're all part of the same circuit. Lyndon Johnson, I think Lyndon Johnson deserves to be relatively, you know, there are presidents with an asterisk next to their name. LBJ has an asterisk next to his name. But it's also, but if you know, I can't be totally generous because I also believed that what was called the credibility gap, Johnson's refusal to level with people about Vietnam, and the guns and butter approach that he took to the war. The fact of the matter is, I think that's when we planted the seeds of a distrust that obviously Watergate nurtured, and subsequently we've never outgrown. And I think, unfortunately, over time, that distrust has morphed into a kind of permanent cynicism. And that cynicism poisons the political atmosphere and, quite frankly, provides the backdrop for extremists on talk radio or the blogosphere. I mean, you know, there's been fake news since time began. The difference is there are now the instruments of communicating it instantly to millions of people, faster than any president can address. So, you know, is Woodrow Wilson a great president? His first term he was. His second term, he was far from a great president. How do you, you know, and again, that's the problem with rankings. If you're going to be really honest, there would be so many different categories, you know. But I think in terms of more recent, I think there's a category, judgment suspended. Ask me again in those 20 years.
Okay. Okay, I am going to exercise my right actually to ask you a follow-up question because it occurred to me as you were saying, answering that last question. Do these rankings have any value, or are they like baseball statistics? You know, we kind of pour over them.
Oh, I don't know. Baseball statistics have value. They do to baseball fans.
Well, yeah.
There's something called the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, you know, and we don't have a presidential Hall of Fame. I guess if you go to Disney World, you can see wax figures that move, or anyway. No, I think it's a power game.
Okay.
But it's also, stop and think, there are very few subjects where erudite academics, you know, lifelong scholars of the presidency can carry the same conversation with, you know, casual C-SPAN viewers, you know, or you know, people reading Ron Chernow's latest biography. It's a language in some ways all its own, and it cuts across. I mean, we live in such a fragmented, fractured society that anything that breaks through those artificial barriers, that encourages, you know, talk among yourselves, as Barbara Streisand used to say on Saturday Night Live, you know, I think is admirable. So it's a power game, but it's more than a power game. And I can tell you, the people who pay the most attention to it are the presidents. They think, some more than others. I really don't think Harry Truman lost an hour's sleep worrying what academics thought of his presidency, and I don't think Ike did either. Unfortunately, we live, again, also in such a self-referential culture. You know, every 24 hours on cable news, we take our emotional temperature and conduct the latest political poll, and the effect, unfortunately, is washed off somewhat on the White House. I mean, there have been recent presidents who were painfully conscious of how future historians might look upon their actions. And there have been others, fortunately, who couldn't give a damn. I think, as a rule, we're all better off with the latter.
Okay. We're going to open it up to questions from you. If you have a question, raise your hand, get the attention. Who else is doing mics? Got somebody way in the back? Okay, Alec. Alec and Chance. Anybody got a question? No, I don't believe this. Oh, there's one. Wait for the mic. Somebody will be with you in just a second.
Can you explain why, after decades, Jackson has fallen so far? He used to be in the top 10.
Yes.
And counter that with the improvement of James Polk and all that he accomplished in one term.
Yeah.
He accomplished everything he said he was going to accomplish. He
Yeah,
ought to be
actually,
higher.
No, it's a great question. They're Old Hickory and Young Hickory, both from Tennessee. Polk was seen as Jackson's beneficiary, and protege, rather, and certainly beneficiary of Jackson's popularity. You're right. For most of our history, Jackson was just outside the very upper ring of American presidents. He was seen as a strong figure, someone who embodied Western democracy, someone who took the office, which, after all, the first 6 presidents, you know, were sort of representatives of the well-bred and the well-read, east of the Appalachians, you know, outgrowths of the Revolution. But no one believed that the presidency was directly connected. I mean, we didn't elect a president. We still don't, through popular vote. Jackson, in his inaugural address, called for the abolition of the Electoral College. Jackson, of course, is also the first American president to believe that he was, as the only official in our government elected by all the people, and he did believe his mandate was from the people and not the Electoral College, that he was a steward of their interests. And in his case, that meant making war on the nascent economic aristocracy of the day, represented by the Bank of the United States. Now, again, for most of our history, if you're Arthur Schlesinger and you've written a book called The Age of Jackson, the odds are you and your like-minded academic friends are going to hold Jackson up as a model, as a precursor to FDR and the New Deal in many ways. And that's how Jackson was seen. There are 2 reasons, I think, why he has tumbled in recent years. The first, again, I refer back to my earlier comment about the 60s. It's not only African Americans who were discovered by historians, but it's Native Americans. And neither of those groups owes Andrew Jackson any favors. Jackson now is seen primarily not as the man who championed economic democracy and who ushered in kind of the age of the working man, if you will, in American politics. He's seen as the father of a kind of American genocide in terms of the treatment of Native Americans, setting in motion the forced relocation of thousands of of Indians from the American South, and of course, as a slaveholder who championed slavery. You know, I'm torn. There was a time, I'll be honest with you, when Andrew Jackson was my least favorite president. And again, we're all subject to change and evolution. I now look upon Jackson as a deeply flawed president who, nevertheless, is one of the 4 or 5 most consequential presidents. That doesn't mean but I mean, Andrew Jackson did open the floodgates for the American people to participate. Between 1824, when he won the popular vote, but lost the presidency to John Quincy Adams, and 1828, when he was elected for the first time, the size of the American electorate quadrupled in 4 years. Nothing like that has ever been repeated in American history. Andrew Jackson arguably, and again, everything is relative, but in the context of his time, Andrew Jackson, more than anyone else, turned a republic into a democracy, or the first draft of a democracy. Andrew Jackson presumed that a president had the power, to, first of all, tell South Carolina, when it wanted to nullify the tariff laws, that he on his own would march an army into the state where he was born, by the way, and drown it in blood, if that's what it took to put down a rebellion. 30 years later, Abraham Lincoln, this new, untested, unknown incumbent, faced with the reality of secession, patterned himself after Jackson. Jackson was his role model. So Jackson is an incredibly complicated figure. I said there were 2 reasons why he had slipped. One, because of the general reassessment of presidential leadership that, for example, worked to Grant's benefit post-60s. The other, and again, I don't mean to be preoccupied with this, but the other, I'm convinced, is, and it's unfair to both men, but I think the fact that Donald Trump has adopted Andrew Jackson, I think without knowing very much about Andrew Jackson. But nevertheless, he's, you know, Steve Bannon told him that he was Andrew Jackson for another age. The fact that he has adopted Jackson, I think, has inured to Jackson's disadvantage among the academics who populate these polls. Polk, see, I would argue that Polk has suffered. Polk used to be up around 9, 10. He was the most important president you never heard of. And you're absolutely right. Uniquely, Polk did what he said he would do in his inaugural address. He laid out 4 great objectives, you know, settling Texas and the Southwest and the Northwest border with Canada, and making up for the fact that Jackson had abolished the bank, creating a kind of proto-Federal Reserve, in other words. And Polk said it, he did it all, and then as he promised, he retired after 4 years, and 3 months later he died of exhaustion, at the age of 49. The shortest ex-presidency of anyone. But Polk has also slipped relative to where he was for a long time. Why? Well, go back to the 60s. There's a phrase, manifest destiny. Polk personifies the idea that God intended for the United States of America to be at the very least a continental republic, that geography and morality demanded that the United States occupy at least to the West Coast. Other presidents would go beyond. Polk added more territory to the United States than any other president, including Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. Much of it he did through war, the Mexican-American War, but much of it he did through negotiations. Oregon, Washington, Idaho, you know, the whole Pacific Northwest is a result of Polk's diplomacy. So you're right. I mean, any way you look at it, Polk accomplished enormous things. However, Manifest Destiny, which for most of our history, again, was a kind of badge of pride. It was almost a patriotic expression, has come to be seen in some quarters, particularly in some academic quarters, as a code word for imperialism. Because what went along with Manifest Destiny? Well, it was a shield for wiping out Native Americans who lived out there. It turned into one of the causes of the Civil War, because having extended ourselves over all of this new territory, invariably the argument would arise, well, can slavery spread into this new territory? Polk, who was sympathetic to slavery from Tennessee, does not ever appear to have thought about that. No one's perfect, including successful presidents. You can argue that by certainly the standards of his day, Polk was one of the most successful of American presidents, but they all leave legacies. And no one would have guessed when Polk died, at 49, that 150 years later, we would be dealing with the history that he set in motion, much of it unwittingly. It's not fair to him to blame him for what occurred after he left the scene, but fairness really enters into academic conjecture.
Okay. You have any other questions? We have a few minutes if you want to ask. Okay, we've got one over here.
Thank you, Richard. It's been great. About 20 years ago, Jeffrey Toulis and a couple other political scientists said that one of the major changes in the modern presidency, as you know, is the rhetorical presidency. And they didn't mean the flourishes, but they meant the fact that presidents use the media to go directly to the public, as Reagan did so well, to say, ring the phones at Congress. So how does rhetorical skill fit into the evaluations, and is it one of the criteria?
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. One of the, communications and ability, persuasive communication. Harry Truman said the chief job of the modern president is persuasion. And that's true. In a way that nobody really cared what William Henry Harrison thought about, during his short month in office. But you can plug in almost any other 19th century president. No one expected them to occupy a bully pulpit. The phrase, didn't come along till TR time. And TR had an opinion on everything. And people were delighted to hear it, even if they disagreed with some of them. The fact of the matter is, again, going back to Clinton Rossiter, 1951, and the immediate, I would argue the 1960s were the height of presidential persuasion, because it's when television came of age. People all say the Kennedy assassination is what, in effect, passed the torch from the written press to television. And stop and think. I mean, people have collective memories seared into their consciousness, not only of that weekend, but of so many events in the 1960s. It was pictures from Birmingham, pictures on television, and in some cases on the front page of the New York Times, of Bull Connor's men with their water hoses and their police dogs attacking black children in the streets. It was those pictures that forced John F. Kennedy's hand in 1963. And subsequently, it's pictures, it's television. Think of Lyndon Johnson standing before a joint session of Congress after Selma and saying, "We shall overcome," knowing that in doing so, he was probably writing his political death warrant in the South, and that for his party, for a generation to come. Richard Nixon is not often thought of as a great communicator, but the fact is, in 1970, as the anti-Vietnam protest movement really gathered steam, Nixon could go on TV and give a speech and move the polls significantly. Part of it was what he said. The silent majority speech is a classic example. But even more is because of the fact that he had access to an audience of 70 or 80 million people. All he had to do, I mean, the stars were aligned for presidents in the 60s. All you had to do was make 3 phone calls to 3 men in towers in New York who ran the networks. There were only 3 networks. No cable, no internet. And that night you could be assured of a captive audience of 70 or 80 million people. And there was no one to talk over you. Poor Eric Sevareid offered instant analysis at the end on CBS, but it was a woeful mismatch. The president had the megaphone. That was the golden age, I would argue, of presidential communication. Ronald Reagan and his ability to go over the heads of the Democratic majority in Congress to pass his economic program. You know, we all remember Oval Office addresses. The next day, we gathered around the water cooler and we talked about it. That was part of the common conversation. And the president who came into our living rooms, who spoke to us persuasively or not, but in any event, the next day, that was the chief topic of conversation. That's gone. That's all gone. When's the last time? I don't even know if there are water coolers anymore. But certainly there aren't people gathered around them talking about what the president said the last night. When's the last Oval Office speech that moved anything? And the State of the Union is a classic case. What a phony event. I mean, and that's totally bipartisan. Lyndon Johnson decided in 1966 he wanted a bigger audience. And so he moved it. It was a daytime event. And he moved it to the evening. And it all started to go downhill. Because television, with all due respect, the television camera ultimately distorts every single thing it touches. It's why, thank God, we don't have cameras in the Supreme Court. And hopefully, at least as long as I'm alive, I don't have to, live through the spectacle of justices mugging, for the television audience or tailoring their comments. The State of the Union address it's Washington's equivalent of Oscar night, and now there's even a red carpet, out in Statuary Hall, where they don't talk about what you wear, but everyone rushes out to get a soundbite in or two. The whole thing is as stylized as kabuki theater, and kabuki theater is a lot more entertaining. Cable TV, these events are made for cable TV. So cable spends a whole week, getting ready for an event that basically most people aren't getting ready for. If you look at the audiences, the television numbers, the great paradox is the more television smothers an event, the more ultimately it drives viewers away. We're seeing that in the Olympics. I mean, there are lots of technological reasons why fewer people are watching television, but I would argue television is its own worst enemy. In turning everything into entertainment, it actually is really underselling the intelligence of the average American viewer. So today, a president gets up and he gives a State of the Union, and before he's into the first paragraph, there are 5 million self-appointed Sevareids out there who are twittering their reaction. Mostly negative, That's another factor. I mean, you cannot estimate, you can't poll, you can't, but you know that just as television distorts events, the social media is profoundly distorting. There is a clear concentration of the negative. It's as if, given the anonymity, the worst people in our culture, decide to be the most vocal. Right or left, it doesn't matter. I remember I've done C-SPAN call-in shows a number of times over the years. And you can trace the degeneration of our public discourse. I once suggested that in addition to the Republican and Democratic and Independent line, that there should be a black helicopter line for those who are particularly wedded to conspiracy theories, right or left. I cannot believe that there are that many people out there who are that demonstrably insane. But if you listened to call-in shows, even on a forum like C-SPAN, it's the angry people. And I understand, it's the angry people who vote. If you're contented, if nothing really moves you, touches you, if you don't feel you have any particular compelling connection to a candidate or a cause, the odds are much greater that you'll stay at home. But if you're angry, anger is a very powerful motivation. It's a powerful motivation to pick up the phone and call C-SPAN. And it's a powerful motivation to sit in front of a screen all day and vomit bile in a way that, unfortunately, is magnified by the nature of the modern media. It's very easy to fall in the trap of thinking that whatever is coming over the transom is representative of public opinion. Whereas I believe, I could be wrong, I believe the reality is it's much closer to those people who don't vote, those people who have mild feelings, those people who don't define themselves by a particular ideology or hatred. And so it's tough. Any modern president has to find a way to deal with those realities and that cynicism and the polarization that has racked our politics for a long time. The only consolation is we've been through worse, and I still adhere to the admittedly optimistic Rodgers and Hammerstein view of the world. I think the more you know about the American past, the more you can be confident of the future. We are a remarkable in a number of ways. We've endured, we've persevered, and we've triumphed over much greater problems and enemies than what we confront. And that's an optimistic note on which to conclude a somewhat pessimistic discussion.
Okay. Well, Richard, thanks so much. It's been terrific.
Thank you. And actually, a special word of thank you to all of you good folks way back there. Thank you for coming. Thank you, everyone, for coming, but thank you for doubling the audience.
Yeah.
We hope to see you Tuesday.
Hope to see everybody Tuesday.